Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Rausan Pereira. Vladimir Putin is set for another 6 years in power after his landslide victory in Russia's presidential election. Putin, who has ruled Russia for almost 2 decades, recorded his best election performance with 76.67% of the vote. The opposition said that the results were rigged, reporting ballot stuffing and other cases of alleged fraud, as the Kremlin pushed for a high turnout to give greater legitimacy to Putin's historic fourth term. Putin, who has extended his power until at least 2024 and is already Russia's longest-serving leader since Stalin, ruled out remaining president for life. The Russian strongman ran against 7 other candidates, but his most vocal critic, Alexei Navalny, was barred from the ballot for legal reasons, and the final outcome was never in doubt. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze what the victory means for Putin, Russia and the world. Joining me on the program today are Professor Pant, Head of Strategic Studies, ORF, Professor Sanjay Pandey, Center for Russian Studies, JNU, and Virendra Gupta, former ambassador. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin with you. What does the victory mean for Putin and Russia?
Well, it's a democratic process, and it means that people of Russia have chosen a leader who can give very decisive and assertive leadership. I think it is an expression that people in Russia want Russia to play an assertive role in the world. And I think the attempt by certain countries in the West to relegate Russia to a certain degree of irrelevance, to me it seems that Russian people do not accept that. I think for us it's a very important development, because we are not talking of a country far away on the horizon, but we are talking about a country which has been very, very close to India. We have a historic relationship, a strategic connect, a close and reliable friend. And I think our discussion really has to be in that context, in that spirit.
Sure. Professor Sanjay Pandey, how much does Russia need Putin for stability and to withstand Western pressure?
For that, you have to understand the situation that Russia was faced with prior to Putin becoming prime minister initially and then president. That was 1990s, just after the Soviet disintegration. Russia was going through a very difficult time of political and economic transition. Economic transition from a command economy to a market economy, liberal economy, and political transition from a one-party state to a multi-party democracy. Preceding that was the period where Soviet Union had been facing serious economic difficulties, GDP lagging behind, its technological prowess was also lagging behind the West. So it was a difficult situation for Soviet Union during 80s. It was a worse situation for Russia in 1990s under Yeltsin. Then there was uncertainty. Many of the republics or regions or constituent units of Russia were demanding independence or separation. The mafia was ruling the roost in Russia. So it was politically very bad, economically very bad. That was the situation in which Putin became prime minister in 1999. And he subsequently was made the president, first acting president, and then got elected in March 2000. Under his leadership, Russia was able to establish, political stability came, economic growth, mainly helped by high hydrocarbon prices, oil and gas prices, starting from 99, almost the same time that Putin became prime minister.
Sure.
The gas and oil prices saw a jump, and for the next nearly 10 years, a decade, they remained so. And that was the time when Russia's GDP growth averaged between 6 to 8%, 2000 to 2007-8. And he was able to bring the various sections, the constituent units of Russia, Chechnya especially, he could pacify it. He could bring the mafia under control. He claimed that he was there to establish dictatorship of law. as against what we call rule of law. He called it dictatorship of law, where no one, neither the oligarchs, the newly emergent capitalist class, nor the regional leaders, none of them would be above law, and all of them will have to fall in line. So he was able to establish political stability, bring economic progress. Standard of living also improved significantly during that period. So that basically accounts for Putin's popularity during the first 2 terms. Subsequently, of course, he took a break and he propelled his Prime Minister Medvedev to the presidency, and he was the Prime Minister, although there was a feeling that he was controlling the system as Prime Minister and as the leader of the United Russia Party. So his ability to provide definite leadership, to bring out Russia from political chaos, and to bring economic prosperity, relatively speaking.
So that's what's worked for him over the years.
That has worked for him over the years.
Okay, let me bring in Professor Harsh Pant now into the picture. With this mandate, does Vladimir Putin have a stronger hold of Russia and a stronger place in the world?
This is a very interesting time. We have just had almost a lifetime coronation of the Chinese president, and now we have another election in Russia, a so-called election in Russia with all its limitations. And I think what we are witnessing is this rise of a certain kind of leadership in certain countries, which you can juxtapose with the Western world, and where the question is whether the West has the capacity to project its political values increasingly the way they used to in the past. And I think that's an interesting juxtaposition between 2 systems which are semi-authoritarian, and in China and Russia, and therefore their articulation of their priorities are going to be very different. So some have argued that this is now a new consensus emerging, Beijing consensus about we will liberalize the economy, but we will keep the control of political power under one institution. And so I think Russian election also falls in some of that category, that with the constraints that were available in the system, I think no one challenged the fact that Mr. Putin would be elected. Everyone knew that he would be elected. I think the question was he wanted to project it with a bigger margin, and he has been able to do that. There is a lot of, I think, support, as Professor Pandey pointed out, for Putin in Russia because of what he has been able to do, bring Russia from where Russia was to where Russia is today. And I think it is also to do with his foreign policy, which is often seen as very assertive, which is seen as challenging the hold of the West. And I think especially the quick military decisions, interventions that he took in Crimea and subsequently in Syria have also reinforced this position of Russia as a major global interlocutor. And I think that is a space that many Russians who were coming out of the Cold War were missing. That look, Russia used to be a global superpower, and now Russia is missing from some of these important global decisions, and the West, some saw it as a deliberate move of the West to marginalize Russia. So I think that sense of coming back to power, and he has been very articulate in that he saw the end of the Cold War as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 21st century. So I think there is an element in him which wants to propel Russia to where it belonged during the Cold War. And so certainly I think as he moves forward now with this renewed mandate, there'll be concerns in certain Western capitals about whether a new Cold War is coming with Russia. Already the articulation remains one of Cold Warish atmosphere being prevailing in the West. And I think how he would take his mandate forward in terms of positioning Russia on other global hotspots, whether it's Middle East or whether it's East Asia, where I think increasingly a Sino-Russian concert is creating problems for a lot of the countries.
Indeed. Talking about the West, Ambassador, several of the Western leaders are mired in their own problems, be it Trump, be it Angela Merkel, be it Theresa May. So is there a bigger role for Putin to play on the world stage?
Well, Russia has always played, in fact, during the Cold War, and as the West would have wished it away for Russia to drown down into irrelevance. That hasn't happened under Putin, and Putin has tried to recreate that space for Russia, which is partly and largely responsible for his popularity. I think from our perspective, and I want to look at things from our perspective, I think this relationship, India, Russia and Putin, can play an extremely critical role because you look at the geopolitical dynamics in our neighborhood. China is increasingly taking an adversarial position to India. Now, what does it mean? In very simple terms, is that we get drawn to America. But is it advisable for us to put all our eggs in one basket? Certainly not, because then we would be in a weakened position vis-a-vis America. Even though geopolitically, in axiomatic terms, it would seem that we are a natural ally of America, but it would still help us to maintain our leverages, maintain our options. And I think Russia, therefore, provides us that space. I think we need to relook, a fresh look at our relationship with Russia. There is a feeling in Russia that we have not paid the kind of attention that Russia deserves to get from us. And I think we need to seriously think about it from our own national interest point of view. It seems to me that not only we have huge benefits to derive in economic terms, in terms of meeting our energy security needs, in terms of investment opportunities, Russian interest in SR oil. So all of that is there. But going beyond economic and commercial parameters, I think a huge geostrategic need will be filled up by India taking a more active interest, India attaching a greater attention, and that can be done, mind you, without compromising our policy with America. There is some concern that, and which feeds both ways, that our growing proximity with America has also caused some resentment in Russia. Likewise, we can warm up to Russia and restore our old ties, because we have a huge military dependence. So we need Russia.
Sure.
And it doesn't help us to neglect Russia.
Okay. Professor, we need Russia is what the ambassador is suggesting. Do you concur? What does it mean? What does this mandate mean for India?
Well, I would say we need Russia because Russia has presented us with an alternative, not in terms of just foreign policy. In the last 100 years, I would say, Soviet Union presented an alternative model of socio-economic development to the Western liberal economy. They had their socialist economy, and India was greatly influenced by that model. We followed somewhat the state-regulated socialistic path of development, good or bad, but Soviet Union presented an alternative of socio-economic model and also in foreign policy. Similarly, in the post-Soviet times, initially it seemed as if Russia was going whole hog on the Western path of liberal democracy and market economy. But subsequently, very quickly, within a decade, Putin, in fact, after coming to power, realized that the type of model that West presented did not suit Russian conditions, and therefore there can be no universal models of democracy or economy, liberal economy. Russia needs to charter its own path, its own course, and in that sense, he again started talking about alternatives. So Russia is an alternative for India. Previously, our political model was also criticized by the West, and our democracy was not always accepted as genuine. It is only last 15-20 years that now we are being hailed and eulogized as a democracy. So we have been fighting for our own model, our own alternatives, our own autonomy and independence. In that sense, Russia is a valuable partner. I totally agree with the ambassador that we should not put all our eggs in one basket in foreign policy or in the larger sense. In fact, I would like to add something what Professor Harsh Pant said. In fact, it was not the Cold War that he called as the greatest catastrophe. He called the dissolution of Soviet Union as one of the greatest catastrophes, and he believes that Russia presents an alternative model and has an alternative position on issues like Palestine or on Syria or on many other issues. So Russia is an alternative which India should always cherish.
Okay. All right. You know, Professor Pant, taking that point forward, now we are going back to the point that the ambassador was making about China. Now, are we going to see renewed and better ties between Russia and China going forward, and should that be something that we should be concerned about?
Yes, and I think I will take a slightly different view from this, because I think it's not simply our need to have Russia as an alternative or as a very, very valuable partner. Russia is clearly a very valuable partner for us. But I think its Russian foreign policy priorities have also evolved. So it's not simply the fact that they used to look at India through the Cold War lens that they have continued. They have now a different set of priorities. Their approach, especially under Putin, has been a largely anti-Western perspective on foreign policy, and that had meant that the prism through which they look at local disputes or regional hotspots or bilateral partnerships has also moved on. So it's not the fact that that we had a special relationship with them during the Cold War, that it would continue. I think for them the priorities have evolved, and in that context China has become very important for them. And so the question for us is really, we would like to develop a relationship, but how far and what are the parameters of those relationships going to be? We have seen some of the problems that have come out in this relationship, and not all of our own making. Some of these are about Russia and Russian foreign policy priorities. So if you think of if you go back to 2 years back and the BRICS declaration, which India found very offensive, in that declaration, I think the problem there emerged when the Russians and the Chinese colluded with each other. So I think there are a whole host of issues, whether it's engagement with Pakistan, whether what Russians are doing in Afghanistan now increasingly. There is a sense in many quarters that I think the partnership with China has become so strong, and Russians, because they view the West as the larger enemy, are willing to be with the Chinese as a junior partner, means that a lot of the time our concerns will be put aside. So I think we need to get a better assessment from the Russians as to what their priorities are, and B, put more effectively our concerns and our red lines insofar as what we deem to be very, very critically important areas where we would like Russian help. And so I think that communication has been missing, perhaps, but it is also not simply a communication problem. It is also a fundamental alteration in how Russians have started viewing their foreign policy. And if you look at their approach, in terms of regional hotspots or in terms of bilateral partnerships, it's the larger prism of their, the contestation with the West, which is the prime determinant of their foreign policy at this point, which would mean that somehow their relationship with China will continue to grow, and it will have some very serious implications for us and how we move forward.
Sure. Ambassador, talking about the contestation with the West, there's a lot of it happening in West Asia. What's likely to happen there?
Well, Russia is following its own approach, and I think there seems to be greater logic in what Russia has raged against the Islamic State and the rebels in Syria, which are supported by these radical fundamentalist lobbies. So I see no problem with that. On the other hand, America's approach is far more muddled. And oftentimes I think that probably America is not even clear as to what they want. And this has come out in public debate, and they've actually admitted that for the moment, Syrian government seems to be of a lesser problem than the ISIS. So they seem to be rather confused. Russia has remained undeterred, and Russia has gone on steadily with its approach. But I'd like to add to what Professor Pant was saying. You see, I don't think that Russia-China axis or relationship can be taken as any fixity. What is there is that Russia is being propelled towards China because of continued antipathy of the West, led by the Americans. But you're already beginning to see changes in that. In fact, when Trump came to presidency in the beginning, he unraveled a new vision of Russia being an ally, in a sense. Then, of course, he was forced to backtrack. But I would see in the time to come, Americans will be forced to realize that China is the biggest enemy for them, that they have to write a new strategic equation, keeping China in mind. And in that situation, Russia is up for grabs, really. Russia is at crossroads. They have to decide as to whether and whose side their best interest would be served.
Sure.
And for India, I don't think we can dismiss Russia purely from the perspective of Russia having moved so close to China. I think there is a lot of option there. There is a lot of room for maneuver. And in the time to come, it depends a great deal on how India plays.
It has to be done right.
With Russia, and how America and the Western countries, and I'm sure we would see an evolution in the Western approach and American approach towards Russia, given the continued assertiveness.
Okay.
Chinese have already begun to regard themselves number one power in the world. So they are going to play a more and more assertive role, and I think this would also bring them into friction with Russia.
Sure. Sure. Professor, taking the point that the ambassador made forward about the US, in 2017, when Trump took office, there was this sense in the world that, there could be a certain kind of closeness between Russia and the United States. There was a sense of bonhomie at that point in time. But all that has changed over time. Why is that so?
In fact, this is not the first time it has happened. If you remember, during Obama's first presidency, there was a talk about reset button.
Yes.
And that did not come about. Much before that, during his early years as president, Putin, just after 9/11, he was the first world leader to call President Bush, and expressing his support for American war on terror. And for quite some time, Putin was very consistent in his support for American actions in Afghanistan. He also provided subsequently, when there were problems in supplies for American forces, there was something called Northern Distribution Network, which passed through Russia and onto Central Asian countries to connect and to supply American forces in Afghanistan. So all that was going on. So Russia, it is not for the first time, or when Trump came, that there was an attempt to improve relations. The problem, as Russians see it, is that they have been increasingly, and every now and then, there has been an attempt to edge them out from their spheres of influence. Iraq was one such case. Iraq was a Russian ally. And despite that alliance, 1972 Soviet-Iraqi treaty, 1990-91, Gorbachev decided to side with West in sanctioning and then in military action against Iraq during the first Gulf War against Saddam's Iraq, against Kuwait. So he proved his intention of ending the Cold War, of creating a new framework of cooperative relations with US. That was a litmus test, and he passed despite the treaty with Iraq. Similarly, 2001, 2003, the Russians definitely said that any action against Iraq is unacceptable, and they were ready to veto any such resolution in UNSC, but it did not come about. So similarly, when Syria came, they saw it as another example of Western attempts to marginalize, to edge out Russia from its friends, from its spheres of influence, something which is unacceptable. Then there was ABM Treaty, 1972 ABM Treaty. In fact, just after Russia expressed its support for American war on terror in 2001, subsequently the same year, the Americans withdrew from the ABM Treaty.
Right.
That was, Russians saw it as a clear slap on their face.
Okay.
So that is the reason that they feel that they have been marginalized, that their opinions and their concerns are not taken into account, and therefore hostility for Russia in West and US.
Right. Professor Pant, there are several other issues as far as Putin is concerned, be it the meddling with the US elections or be it the spy issue in the UK, the poisoning of the spy. How do you see all that panning out in the days to come?
Yes, I think, I'm a bit less sanguine than Ambassador is about that Russia is up for grabs. I think the sentiment in the West has hardened considerably vis-a-vis Russia, and likewise, and vice versa. So I think I don't, at least in the short to medium term, I think the relationships are quite fixed. Mr. Trump, as you pointed out earlier, initially was very vocal about resetting the relationship with Russians, but given the political turmoil and given the context in which he was coming about Russian interference, it would have been suicidal for him to move towards the Russians. So I think the domestic context in which the West is operating now is increasingly, there is an undercurrent of anti-Russian sentiment. You saw that even in the National Security Strategy document that came out, pointedly naming Russia and China as revisionist powers. And I think that is the larger framework around which West and the Western approach to the world is evolving. For them, Russia is a primary concern because it is on their doorsteps. China is still, far away. You see, our concerns at times we get very frustrated that the Europeans, Western Europeans, don't get our Chinese concerns, and it is precisely that because China is far away from them. China may be, getting out there in terms of its projects, but still Russia is the first order of priority.
Right.
So I think that Cold War, and if you look at the newspapers in the West today, they're all about, many of them have used the Cold War analogy.
Yeah, they
so
have.
I think that is a sense that you get from the West, that increasingly the world is being viewed in those terms as far as Russia is concerned, and Russia will respond in kind, as I think both the commentators have pointed out, that there'll be a sense that Russians will entrench their positions, and especially Putin, who has a certain legacy, who cares very deeply about where Russia is coming from, would certainly take Russia in directions where he would like to stand up to the West, because that is also a domestic political strategy for him.
Sure. All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Things are going to remain the same. It could get a little interesting with days to come, is what the panelists here are suggesting. But as of now, of course, the divide between the West and Russia looks like it's going to stay for some time at least. On that note, it's a wrap on the show. See you again next time.